It's a great privilege to be in this company, and let me, without further ado, say what I was going to present before this August gathering. We are at a crucial juncture of human history with risks facing the planet that are truly daunting and which have serious implications for all living species. Since the beginning of industrialization, human society has been responsible for emissions of greenhouse gases, as a result of which the concentration of these gases has gone up to levels that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. Their effects, together with those of other anthropogenic drivers, human-induced drivers, have been detected throughout the climate system and are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. The impacts of climate change are becoming progressively more serious. Rising rates and magnitudes of warming and other changes in the climate system, accompanied by ocean acidification, increase the risk of severe, pervasive, and in some cases, irreversible detrimental impacts. Some risks are particularly relevant for individual regions, while others are global. Climate change is projected to undermine food security. Due to projected climate change by the mid-21st century and beyond, global marine species redistribution and marine biodiversity reduction in sensitive regions will challenge the sustained provision of fisheries productivity and other ecosystem services. For wheat, rice, maize in tropical and temperate regions, climate change without adaptation is projected to negatively impact production for local temperature increases of 2 degrees Celsius or more above late 20th century levels, although individual locations may benefit. Climate change is projected to reduce renewable surface water and groundwater resources in most dry subtropical regions, intensifying competition for water among sectors. I would like to draw your attention to Figure 1, which I'll project now, which shows increases in average temperature, globally average sea level change, globally average greenhouse gas concentrations, and global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Let me go back to the first part of this diagram. You see the increases in temperature, which is on the top diagram, and you would see that there is a fluctuation. That's because of natural factors which bring about changes in climate, but the trend is unmistakable. And if you look at the lower diagram, that gives you sea level rise. And there's no theorizing in this. This is based on actual observations. I would like to now draw your attention to the next set of diagrams under Figure 1. The first one gives you the increase in concentration of 3 major gases. The one at the top in green is carbon dioxide, but that doesn't represent green development. It shows very rapid increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide. And the lowermost figure gives you the sources of carbon dioxide emissions. The gray area is emissions from the energy sector, from cement, and flaring of gas which takes place. So clearly the world is going in a direction counter to what is intended in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into existence almost a quarter century ago. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in 2010 reached 49 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. This represented a very large increase over the emissions in the year 2000, which were at a level of 39 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That means in these 10 years, we have added 10 gigatons of emissions, roughly an average of 1 gigaton per year of CO2 equivalent. At the same time, changes in many extreme weather and climate events have been observed since 1950. It is likely that the frequency of heat waves has increased in large parts of Europe, Asia, and Australia. And it is also likely that human influence has more than doubled the probability of occurrence of heat waves in some locations. Projections of climate change and its impacts till the end of this century only add greater urgency to taking action. Many adaptation and mitigation options can help address climate change, but no single option is sufficient by itself. The fifth assessment report of the IPCC has assessed a large number of mitigation options by which emissions of greenhouse gases can be reduced. Evidence of observed climate change impacts is strongest and most comprehensive for natural systems. In many regions, changing precipitation or melting snow and ice are altering hydrological systems, affecting water resources in terms of quantity and quality. Many terrestrial, freshwater, and marine species have shifted their geographic ranges, seasonal activities, migration patterns, etc. And that's because species obviously move to locations to which they are accustomed in terms of climate. So if the climate changes, you will get migration of species. Apple trees, for instance, will not grow at the same altitude at which they used to grow. They'll move further upwards and so on. And this is particularly true of fish stocks and marine species. Anthropogenic GHG emissions are mainly driven by population size, economic activity, lifestyle, energy use, land use patterns, technology, and climate policy. The representative concentration pathways, which are used for making projections based on these factors, describe 4 different 21st century pathways of greenhouse gas emissions and atmospheric concentrations. The RCPs, as we call them, include a stringent mitigation scenario, which is RCP 2.6, 2 intermediate scenarios, and 1 scenario with very high greenhouse gas emissions, which is basically a business as usual kind of emission scenario. Now, multi-model results show that limiting total human-induced climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius would require, at the beginning of industrialization, it required a budget being adhered to of 2,900 gigatons of CO2. That's at the beginning of industrialization. By 2011, we had exhausted 1,900 gigatons of this budget. So what we were left with was roughly 1,000 gigatons, which perhaps we could emit further without crossing this target of 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, of course, we're in 2015, so this figure is now much less, probably closer to 800 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And this is an issue of contention, because the question is, how much space can developing countries utilize in this 800 plus gigatons of CO2 equivalent, and how much are the developed countries going to continue to occupy as far as this limited space is concerned? So, the agreement that's going to take place in Paris is going to be based on what is referred to as intended nationally determined contributions. These will be offered by each country, and these INDCs should add up to a total reduction in emissions that would make it possible for the world to move along the pathway that I referred to as the 2.6 RCP pathway. Now, here I want to show you figure 2 shows temperature increases for the 4 different scenarios. Now, you see the spread at the top goes as high as 4.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And at the lower end, we have certainly a much lower level of emissions, actually going down to about 0 or the negative range by the end of this century. And you also have a projection over here of global mean sea level rise. And the uppermost point with the do-nothing scenario, if I could call it that, is 98 centimeters. I was just talking to President Gayoom of the Maldives. Can you imagine what 98 centimeters of sea level rise would mean to the Maldive Islands? Most of those 1,000+ islands in that nation are no more than about a meter or so above sea level. Now, it's virtually certain that global mean sea level will continue to rise for many centuries beyond 2100. So it's not going to end at the end of this century. Things will get progressively worse, even if we stop emissions of greenhouse gases today. And sustainable development and equity provide a basis for assessing climate policies. Limiting the effects of climate change is necessary to achieve sustainable development because the impacts on some of the poorest regions in the world would make it impossible for them to develop, leave alone developing on a sustainable basis. And therefore, we need to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases globally, and we have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Delaying mitigation shifts burdens from the present to the future, and insufficient adaptation responses to emerging impacts are already eroding the basis for sustainable development. If there are communities and societies which are being affected by the impacts of climate change on a continuous basis without appropriate adaptation, obviously they would find it very difficult to develop at all. It can be seen, therefore, that actions to deal with climate change are also an integral part of steps that are required to attain sustainable development. Hence, even though climate change is not likely to be explicitly included in defining the Sustainable Development Goals, it is essential that the SDGs are also directed at goals that will help to meet the adaptation and mitigation requirements which are a part of climate strategy. So basically, it is essential that we think of this as a twin challenge, as a twin opportunity, because you really cannot deal with climate change if we are still going to continue with development on an unsustainable basis. Nor can you carry out sustainable development unless you tackle this growing challenge of climate change, which is going to become progressively more serious in every part of the globe, but certainly much more in some specific parts of the globe. So I think there's an issue of ethics, there's an issue of equity, and there's certainly an issue of understanding the science of climate change. Today we have the knowledge on the basis of which we know the gravity and the seriousness of the problem. We also know the steps that need to be taken to bring about that change. And if we delay action further, then the costs and the feasibility of taking action will go beyond our reach. And the impacts of climate change could cross certain thresholds and certain tipping points beyond which even adaptation may go beyond our reach. So this is the message I would like to provide to this distinguished audience, and I think it's for all of us to act essentially as missionaries of knowledge and spread that knowledge by which awareness would induce action, will inspire people to action in every organization, in every sector, and even at the level of individuals where lifestyle changes can be an important part of mitigation activities. So I wish you all the best. Thank you for this opportunity.